Got it. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. I guess a few other people will trickle in as we go, but we are honored to have Dr. Adam Stein join us today. Adam heads the Nuclear Innovation Research at the Breakthrough Institute, has done some really impressive work on modeling energy systems and risk perception, and has been actively engaged with the regulatory bodies that look at nuclear in the US. So we'll have Adam do a bit of a presentation, and then we'll open up for a Q&A. Over to you, sir.
Is there a screen that needs to be shared?
Thanks. Getting that up right now. Hopefully. There we go. I assume everybody can see my screen.
Yep.
Great. Thanks for the invitation. I'm Dr. Adam Stein, Director of Nuclear Energy Innovation for the Breakthrough Institute. I'm going to cover a very wide range of topics today that I hope is of interest to this group. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through some slides in anticipation of having discussion at the end. So we did a modeling study, a very broad and in-depth modeling study that we called Advancing Nuclear Energy. It analyzed the role of nuclear energy in the US from now until 2050. Nuclear energy, as this group knows, is clean energy that's firm, dispatchable. You can site it where you need it, not where the resources are. It also opens up secondary applications such as industrial process heat, desalination, and enables integration of high renewables without the need to build additional fossil fuels such as natural gas plants to back them up. We find that the demand for advanced nuclear energy is very robust in this study across a range of bounding scenarios. We set this up as a bounding analysis intentionally because it's very hard to predict exactly what the future will hold. A lot of studies do scenario analysis where they try to guess what the future will look like. Instead, we said, what is the highest and lowest of very important factors, and went with those. So the outcomes that we have aren't pin a tail on it and say this is the value. It is with high certainty that the future is going to be somewhere in between here. In particular, we looked at very low and high initial costs and very low and high learning rates. We find that with sufficient capital investment and deployment, you can reduce the cost of new nuclear builds by more than 50% over that time period. Early capital mobilization is needed to reach that sufficiently low cost in the mid-2030s through consistent deployment. That means that if the market waits till 2040 to start actually building out nuclear energy, these cost reductions won't be realized. To do that, we need finance parity to de-risk the investment, so the market will say we need to build this now, because right now the upfront cost of nuclear energy, which is very capital intensive, is a factor in decision making whether they want to jump into that market early or late. However, consistent deployment gets you a lot. If you build a steady supply chain, you have orders on the books, you can build out in a very different way than if you have sparse orders and you're doing one-off constructions. learning by doing lets you make the next one better and better and better and reduce cost iteratively. This is observed in every other market, not just in energy, but in almost anything that you build consistently. So we find that consistent building actually makes huge improvements of capital efficiency. You will produce potentially more capacity constructed with less cost versus the other upper and lower bounds as shown here. So similar lower capital gets you more capacity than the optimistic scenario with no learning. How much do we see we can build? Well, between 9 and 22% of capacity in 2050 is nuclear, which generates a much larger scale of 25 to 49% of actual electricity. This is both advanced nuclear and conventional nuclear. We also find that this is very, not just large demand, but inelastic. Even in the very pessimistic, low learning, high cost scenarios, we have 9% capacity and 25% of generation, because that's what the system needs in order to back up all the renewables that get built also in the model. You'll see the yellow and greenish colors on the top of these scales. Those are solar and wind. So the model does build out a significant amount of those as well, but in order to do so, it needs clean, firm electricity. There's also other huge advantages in that nuclear can be constructed where it's needed, not where the resources are, as I mentioned earlier. That includes replacing fossil fuel plants directly. 130 to 223, depending on the scenario, fossil fuel power plant sites were transitioned to new nuclear sites in our model by 2050. The planning and timing of these transitions is very critical. We saw significant delays between the closing of fossil fuel plants and the opening of a nuclear plant, which means that without policy help, that's not going to be useful for a economic transition of those communities to keep the employment going, and et cetera. That gap can be closed, we feel, with proper policy. In addition to that policy, we also find that licensing and regulation, which I work on considerably, is a key factor. HALEU and other fuel availability for some of the advanced reactors in this study. We studied actually 3 independent, discrete advanced reactor types that all fill different niches of the market based on their capabilities. Environmental impact and pre-qualification and feasibility of sites is important because it speeds up not just the licensing, but the construction timelines. And overturning state moratorias and limitations, which I know would interest this group, is also very important. If you look at the map on the right there, those states with orange currently have strict moratoriums in place for their entire state, and they stand to lose billions of dollars of capital investment just from construction of the nuclear sites that are model deployed in those states. So that's a summary of our advancing nuclear report in brief. I wanted to make sure I spent a little bit more time on licensing, because I think that is harder for the average person, even that is enthusiastic about nuclear, to really understand what's going on there. So a brief background on licensing. There's currently 2 frameworks for licensing fission commercial reactors. One's Part 50 and one's Part 52. 50 is a 2-step process where you license the plant and you get a separate operations license. 52 is a combined license where you submit the design and the site characterization and you do it all in one shot. 52 was designed later to try to overcome some of the challenges that earlier plants had with changing designs from site to site to site. So with 52, the intent was to have a standardized design that you would build on multiple sites. that didn't take off. The first plant to get licensed under 52 that might actually enter operation is going to be Vocal. And that has been a patchy process. Almost every new applicant, especially advanced reactor, is taking advantage of the Part 50 framework. There are a few that have gone the 52 route, but by far the majority are planning to use Part 50. The challenge is that both of those were designed specifically for large light water reactors. Some of the requirements only relate to large light water reactors. Many of the standards in those designs aren't technology specific, are sized in concept for a very large system, such as processes that you need to show that you are doing to protect the health and safety of the public that might be totally irrelevant if you think about a reactor that is 1,000 times smaller. It's like trying to regulate a motorcycle with regulations that were designed for a tractor trailer. New designs that want to use these frameworks must satisfy those existing requirements or request exemptions from them. Exemptions are largely only given when you can make a case that they are not applicable to your design, or that you, with significant safety margin, easily achieve them through another means. Either way, the exemptions are not automatically granted. They too take time to write, submit, have reviewed. You pay for the NRC staff time to review it, and then there's still a chance that you're not granted that exemption, even if it is necessary for the overall application to work out. There are many projects ongoing to modernize these regulations, but many either don't go far enough to be effective or are very far behind. One example of one that doesn't go far enough to be effective is there's an alignment rulemaking right now to make the standards consistent between Part 50 and 52. Those take best practices from using each one and try to make both of them roughly the same. That doesn't necessarily help a new designer that doesn't really want to use either, but those are all that are there to use. Another example of one that is delayed is the emergency preparedness rulemaking. It has taken several years to get to the point of being a final rule where it's gone through all the steps, all the public comment, and it's been sitting with the commissioners waiting for them to vote on it for more than a year now. And it just was delayed another 6 months. So it's going to be probably, per the NRC stated timeline, 18 months after the final rule got to the commissioners before a decision will be made on whether to finalize it or not. In 2019, Congress said, we need a new framework that is technology inclusive because the existing ones are not, and it needs to be there to enable innovation and commercialization of advanced nuclear. That's the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act. That act also says that it's to realize the environmental, economic, national security benefits of these nuclear reactors. So it did not just say, take what you have, make sure that it's the same level of public health and safety, but technology neutral. It says also needs to realize that there's these other benefits and enable the innovation to make that happen. Part 53 is the backbone of that framework. It's supposed to be technology neutral, but it's also supposed to be two other things. Risk informed, which means you focus on the most important risks, or the features or systems that are most important to the risk of the profile of the whole plant. And it needs to be performance-based, which means it uses metrics that are based to achieve performance objectives. I usually use an analogy where the existing frameworks are prescriptive. They say what you must do. So if you envision a car, you must have a car that has 4 wheels. It has turn signals on each corner that are at least a certain height above the ground. It has a certain stopping distance. It has airbags on both sides, et cetera, et cetera. It says it prescribes things that must do, it must be, or how it must act. Performance objectives are broader and allow more flexibility. Instead of saying it must have 4 wheels and all those other things, it says the car must be able to go straight down the road, steer to avoid obstacles, stop in a distance to maintain safety for the occupants. The safety objective is this. You must make sure that you meet those objectives. And then developers can more flexibly design their car, or in this case, a reactor, to meet those objectives. But the Part 53 developmental process has had significant challenges. We recently put out a white paper about the major challenges for this. We focused on 7 of them, although there are more. I'm going to focus on even less of them in this talk due to time. But they are quantitative health objectives, facility safety program, as low as reasonably achievable in the rule as a design characteristic, alternative evaluation of risk insights method, having some of these deterministic and prescriptive provisions in this performance-based rule, the overall structure of the rule, and whether or not it actually satisfies the mandate given in NEMA. First, the rule structure. Right now, there's 2 separate frameworks, an A and a B. A relies heavily on probabilistic risk assessment, or PRA. Many stakeholders have objected to this, as a formal PRA is time-consuming and restrictive, especially for, say, a very small or very exceptionally safe reactor design. And it wouldn't be a safety benefit versus other methods. There are other ways to do risk analysis other than PRA. Framework B is largely duplicative of Part 50 and 52, but they made it mostly technology neutral. So they've taken out many of the LWR specific requirements, but it's still the same deterministic, prescriptive type method, not performance-based. They've also introduced the alternative evaluation for risk insights, which is ARI, which is a way to satisfy that framework without needing to do a PRA at all. Almost every stakeholder has indicated that just a single framework with high-level performance metrics should be used instead of these separate frameworks. And these specific ways to accomplish those high objectives should be in guidance instead of actual strict requirements in a rule. We recently published something on ARI that shows mathematically that it's simply impossible. The requirements as they have them defined are so conservative that they assume a bounding event occurs every year of operation, which is not feasibly possible to have a severe accident where you melt your core, rebuild it, start it up, get approval from the NRC, and then have another accident within a year. That is infeasible on every level. Similarly, this frequency contravenes NRC policy and practice. They would never let a reactor restart, even if they could rebuild it in a year, right after having a core melt event, and do so again and again and again for 40 years. Quantitative health objectives, I've also published a very detailed white paper on, and I'm going to actually step through a couple of those slides. But the quantitative health objectives are part of the NRC safety goals. These are not actual requirements in any rule. And the commission has repeatedly said that they are supposed to be guidance for how the staff views regulations, not to actually use as a metric in a rule at all. Still, the NRC staff put it directly in the rule for Part 53. The QHOs, or quantitative health objectives, are also not usable as a performance method because health outcomes are estimated using the linear no threshold model and not actually directly calculated. To be a performance metric, you need to be able to calculate in real time, so you know whether a applicant or a licensee in this case actually is complying with that objective or not. It's not calculatable because of uncertainty, but also because it's literally in the statistical noise. QHOs are a metric of cancer rates, cancer mortality relative to all cancer rates in the US. So as you see in the chart I made on the right, the dotted line for each state, that's where the QHO is. And the rates of cancer mortality in every single state are declining, which means you're measuring this against the changing environment. They also don't directly match the QHOs. Most are more than 20% below the assumed QHO rate. The uncertainty is so great that you see the QHO assumed rate on the right. No state is even close to actually getting to that rate. And there's a wide variety of rates by state. So if you adjust by state, not just the US overall, the confidence interval is even larger. Even at a state level, the adjusted QHO is just simply in statistical noise. What does that mean? That means that there is not enough statistical power to calculate it. Even if you find a statistical significance, like a P result, it's not the same as statistical power. It means your sample size isn't large enough to observe whether something actually exists or not. You generally get a false negative or a false positive. And you can't tell which without a large enough sample size. It's almost like asking one person what they think about something. As you were discussing before this presentation started, some people are doing that in meetings, expressing their opinions, whether it's pro or anti-nuclear, and assuming that because one person said it, it represents everybody. You can't determine that. You don't have a large enough sample size. So how do you improve statistical power? Well, you need a larger sample. To get to a larger sample, you need to not only have more people that are affected. So if it was a small accident and only a small number of people affected, you would never get to a large enough sample. But if a large enough population was affected, you would have to follow them through their lifetime to observe whether a cancer occurred or not. As you see with the vertical dashed line on the left side of this chart, that's 5 rem dose per person. So if everybody in a very large emergency planning zone receive 5 rem, which is at the upper bound of what would happen in an accident, and you track them through their entire life, it would still not be enough, because you would need about 5 million people in that sample to have enough statistical power. And the largest EPZ 10 miles around the planet is about 1.2 million, and that was Indian Point, which, as we know, is now closed. You'd also have to track them over their foreseeable lifetime, and most of the effects would come 10 to 20 years later, which means this is not useful for actually measuring whether a licensee is complying with the requirements of the license if you say, oh, 20 years ago, you violated this. So I've actually talked a little bit longer than I planned, but I would love to discuss any of this with you.
Thank you, Dr. Stein. So guys, please raise your hand either in the image or in the reactions, and we'll start with David.
I have a question about why this is happening this way at the NRC. Can you give us any more idea about what you see about the internal workings, whether the problems are political or methodological, staff related? Why are they being so intransigent about this relative to what Congress instructed them to do?
The challenge with Part 53 is partially rooted in the timeline. NEMA required they accomplish this by 2027, And then Congress sent a letter, which isn't law, saying, we want you to get this done by 2024. And then the commission told the staff, we want you to get this done by 2024. And the staff said, okay, but we can only do that if we start by using the existing rules as a basis. And that was where we went off the rails. And it's been off the rails ever since, from the very start of the rulemaking plan. So stakeholders like Breakthrough Institute have been trying to get them away from that, saying, you might think that you will get to a rule by 2024 taking this approach, but it's not going to be a rule that anybody will use. We need to realign this with actual expectations of NEMA now before it's too late.
Thank you.
I
While
have
others-
I
Sorry,
have a
go ahead.
question. I was struggling to raise my hand. Is there a country or perhaps a country in a certain time period that you think is a good model for us to emulate? Something like the US in the 1950s or 60s, or France in the 70s, 80s, or South Korea or China now? Or is that not really like a helpful way to look at the problem?
That is not a helpful way to look at the problem, because
Right.
those countries achieve success in part by nationalizing the early projects and picking a winner in terms of technology. And as our advancing nuclear report showed pretty strong, convincingly, at least to me, we need several reactor designs because they fit different applications, not just in the grid, but in non-electricity applications. And so picking a winner here would be detrimental outside of just electricity.
Dietmar?
After your presentation, I mean, we ended with the NRC and the regulatory approach and the downsides of what you have observed here. Can you steelman the NRC for us? Can you explain how one would defend what the NRC is doing, and how what people would argue to explain in the most positive terms, and your response to that, aside from like the timing pressure on part 53, which I never heard. It's a good argument.
So in positive terms, the NRC's self-defined mission is to provide a reasonable assurance of adequate protection of health and safety to the public and protect the environment. And so with that view, the goal is to make sure that nothing goes wrong. And that's what they're doing. They are being exceptionally conservative to avoid any potential accident. And that is a deeply held belief at the NRC. However, the actual mission given to them through the Atomic Energy Act and the Reorganization Act of 1974 is broader than that. It's the general welfare of the public, and it is national security, energy independence, a whole bunch of other things that look beyond the fence line of the power plant to benefits to the public. But the NRC has said that, no, we just regulate health and safety and environment protection, and that's that. And so to the NRC, they know that they need to modernize and do things that are not LWR specific. They know that they need to increase and gain a younger workforce because they have a lot of attrition right now through retirement. And they know that things need to be a little bit more flexible because they're getting a lot of applicants from a wide variety of reactor types. But they don't see the difference in the mission of that it's also for broader benefits to the public. And without internalizing that, I'm not sure that they're going to have the same perspective on what should be done as external stakeholders in Congress do.
follow up on that. When you challenge them with this kind of assumption that they are emphasizing the safety aspect over all other concerns and don't balance it for the with the opportunity costs of like denying a license extension, there will be a coal-fired power plant, for example, those health effects will be much, much worse and guaranteed than anything that could be imagined by a license extension, for example, or something else. They deny that. They say, no, we do balance. That is part of our mission. But you're saying in their actual regulatory practice, they fall short of balancing this. They're so focused on their field and safety, and that's it.
In this case, NEPA is a highlight. NEPA requires a no action alternative to be considered. No action alternative means you have to consider what if you didn't build the plant. And for nuclear, but if you didn't build the plant means you can consider, although they don't usually, we might be making progress on that with them, but they haven't considered in the past the impacts of a fossil fuel plant, right? It's there that they could do that. On the other side, for safety, no, they absolutely don't consider that at all. They have set the safety goals or deterministic metrics that a reactor must meet, and that's that. It has nothing to do with the alternatives. Although the safety goals, the very top level of safety goal says that nuclear energy should not impose more risk to the public than other energy sources. And that's where they stop considering. They don't actually do that calculation. They then realign it to the QHOs, which is relative to cancer risk. It has nothing to do with other energy sources.
Herschel? Herschel, we can't hear you. You got to turn on the mic, Herschel.
Yeah, just unmute.
Yeah, I asked him to unmute. He seems struggling. Why don't we
move to Alan and come back to you, Herschel?
Okay. Hi, Adam. Thanks. We have heard recently, I've been hearing on the Twitters and other places about this idea that replacing a coal plant with a nuclear plant has another issue that's been coming to light, which is the fact that the site is more radioactive than NRC regulations will allow once it's under the purview of NRC regulations because of the coal ash and other things. So is that something that is being worked on? Is that something you're aware of? It seems like it's related to this whole thing. So I thought I'd ask. Thanks.
That is normally a good consideration. There's two things with that. If it's beyond a certain limit, the EPA will require that site to be remediated and turned into a brownfield site first before anything could be built on it, which would reduce the background there. Second, NRC regulations do allow for consideration of a pre-existing background radiation levels at a site, and then it releases from the plant are relative to the naturally occurring background. So that would be taken into consideration.
Is that a likely thing to be able to do? I mean, is it easier? It's obviously easier than remediation physically, but is it bureaucratically easier to do that?
No, it will be done regardless. You will consider the existing background rates at any site that you build on. It's part of the environmental review.
So it's not an issue?
No, I don't think it is an issue. The bigger issue would be expedience of remediating a site that needs to be remediated, because if a plant closes and it has to be remediated, that's going to be years of a gap
Right.
between closing that plant. And nobody can go years without employment. So that's not really a benefit to that town at all. That's a concern of mine, because not only to the people of that town, but also the political will to try to transition that site.
Sure. Yeah, you
is
need
going
inertia,
to-
right? You need the
right.
inertia. Right. So I guess I'm still not sure I'm entirely clear.
So when you do an environmental review for any site, which is part of the
Right.
NEPA review for
Right.
your construction permit, depending on whether you go part 50 or 52, characterization of the already existing background rate is part of that. So you have to do it, and if it's high naturally, the NRC doesn't say that you have to reduce the natural background rate. They just take into consideration what that rate is during operations to see if there's higher rates occurring once you start operating.
Could I have a follow up on that? So if I would turn a coal-fired power plant into a gas-fired power plant, I would not be forced to remediate the site. I could just do a conversion and start generating electricity with gas. But if I would turn it into a nuclear plant based on NRC regulations, I would first have to remediate all the coal ash and radioactivity that is there from the coal operation first.
Yes, and this is an EPA problem, not an NRC problem in this case. Once the site is retired from being that power plant, that's when they consider remediation. So once you close that coal plant or gas plant, at that point, the EPA would consider whether remediation would have to occur.
So even if I would turn the coal plant into a gas-fired power plant, I would still first have to remediate based on EPA rules.
Not
There's
if
no
you actually
discrimination.
convert the same plant. Because then the same plant still exists, you're just repowering it.
And can we repower a coal-fired power plant with a nuclear plant?
There are some that are talking about doing this, yes. It is not my preferred pathway to building new nuclear, because the existing components in a coal plant are not optimized to what a nuclear reactor puts out, both in heat rates, enthalpy, a couple other factors. And if your reactor isn't sized to it, then you're going to get low efficiency from the plant. And you don't want to resize your reactor.
Let's
for
move to
every coal
Herschel.
plant.
Jim next.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
My personal view and experiences is that the staff is incapable of solving this problem. That's why you're getting the results you're getting. It's also inconsistent with job security. The answer to what we have to do to regulate, in my view, small modular reactors, we're going to have to come from outside the NRC and then present it to the NRC. Otherwise, they're going to be in trouble with Congress. I have some thoughts on what might work, and I will send you an email to that extent. I have to admit I'm a little conceited in this regard. In March of 1992, I came before all 5 commissioners and I presented what is now called risk-informed regulation. It was based on that. So it is doable, but it had to come from someone outside the system. I will send you an email and outline what I think has to be done.
Great. Thanks.
Jim is next.
Hello, you hear me? Yes, okay. I had a question. Earlier, you talked about how the safety goals or safety standards were not based on comparison to other energy sources. But I thought I heard maybe they were based on something else, or maybe it's just completely arbitrary, given that it's not based on comparison to other energy sources. So could you clarify that for me? What is the basis of the safety goal?
1986, the commission decided that they had to try to put together how safe is safe enough. And that became the safety goals. These are, as they say, goals of what the commission would like to try to achieve through their regulation standards. They're not intended to be plant-specific requirements, but it's like an onion. The top level, what's known as the qualitative objectives, is that nuclear power should be as safe or safer than other alternative energy sources. Then you get to quantitative objectives. This is where the commission started assuming things. They assumed that the public would consider that to be equivalent to 0.1% of all cancer rates prevalent in society. So you go from the qualitative, what do we think it should be, to the quantitative, and they relate it to cancer rates from all cancer sources. Keep in mind, this is at the height of lung cancer from smoking, right? The correlation doesn't make sense to me, but they were trying to find a metric. And at that time, to be forgiving to them, there wasn't a good metric quantifying the health impacts of fossil fuel plants. So what else would they use? Maybe they should have used nothing instead of a bad metric. But then from there, from the 0.1%, that's where you get into what is called the derived health objectives, which are the QHOs, which is a 2 in 10 million probability of mortality from cancer relative to nuclear power.
Okay. It's just a specific question. When you say 0.1%, is that over the country or most exposed individual you're living near a plant?
That is national average.
My gut instinct is that, nuclear is millions of times safer than that. I don't know. Am I wrong?
In fact, nuclear energy is statistically orders of magnitude safer than the QHOs. So
Okay.
instead of being 2 in 10 million, it's somewhere around 2 in 150 million, or some estimate it's more like 1 in a billion probability of cancer rates from nuclear power through the operational history of LWRs. So the staff now in Part 3 is using that as justification, backward justification, saying LWRs have met this standard, new reactors should have no problem, and so we're going to make it a standard. Well, it wasn't supposed to be a standard, it was supposed to be a goal, and making it a standard is something you can never show whether it actually is occurring or not in real time, which is my argument with using them.
If I may, a little further on this. If the present light water reactors are already 100 or even 1,000 times smaller than this quantitative goal of 1 in 1,000, you'd have to have the advanced reactors 1,000 times more risky as a group than the light water reactors. And they could still meet the goal. Yet there's every reason to believe that the emerging small modular reactors will be equal to, or even perhaps safer than the LWRs. I think the natural conclusion that I reach is that if the staff really implemented what this 1 in 1,000 or 1 in a billion, they would find that most of their regulations are not risk significant. And therefore the jobs that implement these regulations are really unimportant to the protection of the public, and they're in deep trouble. The commission will have a hard time justifying any kind of safety goal for any reactor, because when you look at the light water reactors, it's a non-problem. It's extremely difficult to cause an early fatality, and I don't know if you can cause a latent one. And if you can, it would be truly a very small part as what the public accepts. So the problem with the commission is if they do an honest job, they're out of work.
The commission did a almost decade-long series of reports called the State of the Art Reactor Consequence Analysis, or SORCA.
Yeah.
In one conclusion of that is that, and this is their wording, the probability of an early fatality being a prompt fatality from radiation sickness or something similar to that is essentially zero.
Yes.
And the probability of a latent fatality in the most severe accidents was just over the QHOs, but the majority of them were 2 orders of magnitude under the QHOs, less likely. And that was their own studies. And so in most actions, they have stopped even analyzing. To their credit, they have stopped even analyzing early fatalities, saying that the probability is essentially zero.
That's right. So in effect, they're saying they're satisfied with the QHO for early fatalities, but even on the latents, if they're 2 orders of magnitude, and with a very faulted kind of analysis, because they just do not account for recovery. They just take the linear stuff and somehow magically it becomes a latent fatality. Where's the risk? Where is it? Where are the mechanisms that would make small reactors 100 or 1,000 times more risky than our vast experience with LWRs? Doesn't exist. For some of the same reasons that you can't produce an early fatality, a lot of it is meteorological, a lot is biological. There is some part of it has to do with the design, but fundamentally, if you go through the whole process of what causes an early fatality, you have all kinds of natural events which are independent of the design of any reactor, and it gets to be vanishingly small. So it's hard, if you really, if the commission said, yes, LWRs are way below our very strict quality QHOs, quality, health rules, and we don't see any situation which would make a big difference in the advanced reactors, what then is their job? And it's very little. Well, it has something to do, of course, with the design. There were, going back to Suwarka, for example, Suwarka did a study of what happens if all the have an accident like a station blackout, and no operator takes any action, and no active piece of safety equipment like the emergency core cooling system, none of it works. The only remaining barrier between the reactor and the public is the containment. And they do this analysis and they come up with a situation where almost nothing gets out to the public. It all gets trapped inside the containment building by natural forces. So even if some safety equipment, in the view of the staff, needs a little more nudging one way or the other, here's the Suwarka stuff, which has been peer reviewed and approved of. It says, no, if I have a good barrier, it doesn't have to be all concrete and steel. If I have something equivalent to a containment barrier, I'm not going to have a source stream of any significance. And what gets out will get out very gradually and be much smaller. And that is exactly what happened in Fukushima. It was delayed, it was a slower release, and it was much smaller. And as a result, essentially zero health effects from radiation. So the staff doesn't, in my view, have a strong technical argument to make that nuclear power is a threat even equal to their old QHOs. It's way below. I can't see that small modular reactors would be any different, probably even smaller. The point is, what do you do if you are a staff person and your meal ticket disappears?
Right. So let's move on to Gary.
Sorry, Isuru,
Doris.
that's what happens. That's what happens. So I will write to Adam and lay this out.
Yeah.
There are other ways to solve this problem, mostly through consequence analysis, not PRAs. You don't need a PRA to prove it.
Thanks.
Dr. Stein, thank you for your in-depth analysis. You've obviously given this a lot of thought, and given that what the NRC has attempted is wholly inadequate, do you have some thoughts on the best path forward? You know, I've heard it suggested that perhaps the NRC should be abolished or an entirely new agency formed, or other avenues. How do we move forward from where we are now?
The NRC, the best path forward is for the NRC to actually consider risks relative to other energy sources, and they will quickly find that it is in the best interest of the public to license more expeditiously with lower thresholds of what they consider adequate in order to work in the general welfare of the public. That's part of the mandate, their legal mandate by law, in my view, already. So they just need to be told by Congress, this is what you really need to be doing here. Second is there is a lot of cultural inertia at the NRC. That's going to need to be addressed significantly, but there is also a lot of retirement from the NRC right now. The challenge is in part going to be getting the workforce to grow in general, because it doesn't have the best reputation right now. And new graduates don't want to go work there because they see it as a barrier instead of an opportunity to help. And most people don't graduate with the degree thinking, how can I go be a barrier? They want to go fix something or help something, especially engineers. That's what engineers love to do, is fix things. So those are two big components. The third, I would say, is that the framework that is Part 53 itself needs to be salvaged. We don't get many opportunities to write a whole new framework. Part 52 was promulgated in 1992 or 3. And the first plant that is going to come online is Vogel 30 years later. Part 53 can't be this dead in the water licensing framework. We're not going to get another shot. So it needs to be fixed, and Congress needs to give more direction. And then the commission needs to give the staff clear direction about what should be in and out of that rule. All the new current applicants say, oh, we're just going to use Part 50 and 52. They have to say that. That's all there is. They also have to say they can get through that. Otherwise, they would have nobody would want to purchase a reactor if there was no confidence they could get a license, right? But Part 53 really is imperative, because decisions in one framework are being replicated in another framework. For instance, ARI is largely similar to the maximum credible accident that Oklo was trying to include in their licensing framework. The NRC said no to Oklo's methodology, and then basically designed their own version of it in ARI for Part 53 instead. So they're all connected. It's not like one framework is totally separate. And we need to think about these things as connected. Decision in one place affects another.
So I'm hearing you say that really the first thing that needs to be done from an advocacy point of view is talk to Congress and get them to apply some heat to NRC to basically follow the mandate they've been given. Is that right?
Yes. And we are, as Breakthrough Institute, we are spearheading an initiative, Build Nuclear Now, at buildnuclearnow.org, that is focused mostly on getting these messages to key stakeholders like Congress or state leaders or et cetera, to try to spread that particular pressure.
That's great. Thank you.
Jim?
Do you say Tim or Jim?
Sorry, you.
Me. I have a brief statement followed by a genuine question. I have something I don't understand. In terms of engineers, the real truth is that if they want to help nuclear move forward, the NRC is probably the main place that they need to go. Okay, anyway, that aside, I'm actually genuinely confused by something to do with the PRA analyses. You know, we heard that NRC stopped analyzing because it's so obvious that, you know, any plant would not be able to cause harm, and it would meet the, I forget the acronym, you know, it meet that easily. Not only that, we have decades of science that are behind LNT, you know, if you're willing to assume it. We all know it's conservative, but we know conservatively LNT tells you what radiation effects will be at most. So given that background, I'm genuinely not understanding why plants would have to do, what is this, like if they had a meltdown, they would have to, you know, open the books again and do an epidemiological study and all. I honestly don't understand why that's necessary. Why don't they just say we release this much radiation, you know, the dose profiling say that, you know, there was this much exposure to the public conservatively under LNT, therefore no more deaths than this. Or going beyond that, I heard it said elsewhere in this conversation that NRC already knows it can't, you know, create a problem. So anyway, could you clear up the confusion for me why there would be required to do this work?
There's two different components here. The first is a safety case. The NRC is in a position of saying, show me, prove to me that your safety case. They don't tell you how to prove it. It's up to the applicant to submit an application that proves the safety case. In that safety case, they would say these are our bounding events, these are our potential releases and source terms, things like that. That is where you do your PRA. You look from the ground up, nuts and bolts, safety systems, operational programs that maintain your equipment, etc. How things function, what could fail, when something fails, what is the tree of follow-on failures, what could domino, etc. What other follow-on components could fail that could lead to other things. That's what a PRA is. It's a detailed, systematic approach to finding weaknesses, essentially. It takes a long time, costs a lot of money to do. You need to get it peer reviewed by somebody else. It's way more in depth than you should be required to have to do for, say, a microreactor, where there are so few components, so few systems. It's just the cost that is not needed to show the safety case. Now, the epidemiological study that I was talking about would be the only way that you could show that you didn't meet the QHOs because there is too high of a rate of cancer around the plant after something. That's oversight. Once the plant's in operation, the NRC needs to have oversight to make sure that they are operating within those safety limits that they were approved to operate in. And if you use something like the QHOs, there's no way to show in real time that they're achieving those objectives. There's no way to have oversight in real time. And that's the problem there. So you have the safety case, which you get your design and plant level license for, and then you have your operational license and the continuing operational oversight of the plant when it's in operations.
I remain confused because I thought the analyses showed that any plant would easily meet the requirement. And I'm also disappointed you have to do a PRA at a plant by plant basis. I mean, you should be able to just do it part of the DCA. You know, this plant design is this safe.
that was the goal of Part 52, would be that you have a standard design, and therefore you could basically attach that DCA for that reactor design to multiple sites.
Right. And the
That-
problem was,
The problem, there's a couple problems with that. Particularly, you might not know the site when you're doing that. NuScale went that route to get a design certification early that they could apply to multiple sites later. Normally under Part 52, you would put it all in together. You put in your safety case and your environmental review case for that site all at once. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to do just the reactor design safety case, so they did a design certification. In Part 50, they are always separate. You do the design and the operational license separate.
but in 52, you're saying you don't necessarily have to do a PRA for each reactor or each site.
Each site, right? There are some, the NRC will identify some site level components that probably need to be considered, but it's not a full PRA again for each site. Most of the PRA from your design certification will be applicable to be used on multiple sites.
Kind of like we do for CAS. They're like, here's a set of input parameters for the PRA, the generic PRA. We're within the bounds, kind of like we're within the bounds of the licensing analysis, and say, we don't have to do any more work. I mean, is that at least somewhat true?
Yes. I mean,
Okay.
if you did a Part 52 application for Susquehanna, and then you wanted to build the exact same plant at Peach Bottom on the same river, 20 miles away from each other or so, there'd probably be almost no or very little site level analysis to do.
You have to do the report, but it's probably a thin one.
Yeah, most of it is referencing other analyses that were already approved. But if you wanted to do Susquehanna at Diablo Canyon, which is no longer river cooled, it is in a much more seismically active area. Susquehanna is in one of the least active areas in the nation. Then you would need to do some site level analysis as well.
Okay.
I have a
Thank
question.
you. Gary?
May I?
Hold on, Herschel. Let's give Gary a chance.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Hey, Dr. Stein, I'm curious who you're working with at the NRC, and because your comments seem really critical, and I'm sort of surprised at that because I had worked there 40 years ago, and the staff was mostly pro-nuclear, even though they were professionally bound to be agnostic towards nuclear and to try to regulate the industry. I've worked with the NRC on a lot of different projects, although not in the last couple of years. And so I am curious to know, your analysis is from personal relationships with people at the NRC, or from reading through 10 CFR 53 or something different?
Well, all of the above. I've worked on nuclear regulation for many years now. Either myself or somebody on my team goes to quite literally every new reactor meeting at the NRC and has for years now. And most of the things that I spoke about today are actual problems that we have brought up to the staff on many occasions, showing our analysis, and they are quite unwilling to make any adjustments.
Is there a specific contact at the NRC that you're addressing, or is this to a general office?
Well, there are many specific contacts. Considering we work on everything that relates to new reactors, it's the whole office of nuclear reactor regulation that we interact with. And we interact with every single commissioner as well. So it's quite broad. Some of them are very reasonable, as you say, but some of them are very, very not reasonable and would like to impose things that are quite literally impossible And those are things that we have to push back on.
Are you working with the Office of Nuclear Energy also at DOE?
Oh, yes, we work with DOE. We spend most of our time working with and at the NRC directly, but we do work with DOE as well. For instance, we recently had a webinar 2 months ago now, I guess, on consent-based siting with DOE for their consent-based siting program.
Okay, is that just almost, is there a specific contact that you're working with at the NRC? Someone we could possibly talk to or contact directly?
About which subject though? Because as I said, we work on.
Mostly new reactor regulations that they're putting out.
If you would like to reach out to somebody, the top person is Ms. Andrea Vale.
Andrea Vale,
Yes.
is she in
VEIL.
Bethesda or is she in Washington? Or
She's in Bethesda. She is the director of that office.
and does she have a nuclear background or a physics background? Or?
I'm not actually quite sure. She is, I will say that she is a very bright person that listens to our concerns, but it is generally the staff under her that is making these challenging decisions in a way that has led me to have to interact with her more than should it be necessary.
How would you spell her last name?
VEIL.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your presentation.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Gary. So Rezwan had to run, but I'm going to read out her question. Kind of given the challenges that you raised and the kind of apparent evidence that nuclear is safe, if not safer than most renewables, and people have suffered from either opportunity costs of premature nuclear shutdowns or nuclear not getting built. Is there a way to cut through the red tape through something like a class action lawsuit arguing tort? Is Breakthrough working on this already?
Tort law is largely not applicable to anything related to nuclear due to the Price-Anderson Act. The same function that removes some of the liability that is directed to companies in the event of an accident beyond a certain point that the government then backs up the coverage, also augments how tort law works.
We will convey that. Ryan Pickering.
Thank you, Dr. Stein. I look forward to rereading the Advancing Nuclear presentation. I read it when it came out, and we're learning all the time. My question is, have you seen any novel financiers of nuclear coming forward? You know, traditionally these were financed by utilities. We saw the announcement of Dow Chemical and X Energy. Do you see any other types of categories or specific companies or groups coming together to finance new nuclear?
By new nuclear, you mean actually construction projects? Because NuScale and X Energy both went public recently through SPACs, which is definitely a new way to approach funding an organization that per se how Westinghouse and GE grew up. There are many venture capital firms that have contributed to many of the smaller startups. And then you have large-scale individual funders that have worked to fund projects or companies like TerraPower, for instance, that's led by Bill Gates, but also many other individual, very large wealth backers. So there's a very wide variety of investment pathways right now. I recently presented to an S&P Global Finance conference where investors were largely there to talk about financing renewables. And then I had the one presentation about nuclear, and they're like, we can actually invest in this. And so some large scale banks just don't see this as an opportunity yet. So your typical investment pathway is the one that's still sitting on the sideline. And once they get involved, that's where, quite frankly, the majority of money actually is.
Thank you.
Perez?
Yeah, thank you, obviously, Adam, for being with us, especially in these hours. So thank you for your patience. One question that I had was relative to Part 53, right? So we talk about Part 50, Part 52 being what most vendors say that they can use. And admittedly one of them, right, saying that we can use one of these two parts. A lot of what we notice is that it's to accommodate different business models, right? Where also Part 50 and Part 52, depending on how you want to operate as a company, right? So for example, NewScale, I think, was interested in not being a utility. So for them, it made sense to have a design certification and then basically go and per site, each respective utility goes through that process, but they have their certified design. It's just unfortunate they only have it for their 50 megawatt and not for their 77 megawatt just yet, but hopefully that will happen soon. But my question about Part 53 and my critique of Part 53 is a bit different. I felt like it more has to do with trying to do too much in the same regulation. Because in Part 53, what I see is that there are two debates. There's one, which is how do you have a technology neutral licensing framework, which is super hard to make in and of itself. And then you have a second added difficulty, which is how do you have a licensing framework that is amenable to all reactor sizes? Micro, SMR, large reactor, because I would argue that you can be a different type of technology, but if you're a large scale reactor, then Part 50 and Part 52 does make sense. But it's true that in terms of if you're trying to build at smaller outputs, the amount of stuff that they're asking is super onerous. So do you think that maybe another alternative viewpoint would be that maybe Part 53 is trying to do too much, and that there should be a Part 53 focused on technology agnostic, framework, and another Part 54 on, having a linear or at least a proportional to output type licensing framework?
I don't agree with that, and this is why. I think that you're trying to solve a problem the NRC created themselves. If it truly was performance-based, you'd have these high-level performance objectives, such as this threshold of dose could get out in a severe accident. That's technology neutral. That's an objective that every design could have.
Exactly.
And that's easy to say. That's not hard to put in writing.
What's cumbersome is when you have to apply for the non-applicability exemptions and et cetera. But yes.
Oh yes, that is very cumbersome. Yeah. But if Part 53 was a single framework with high-level performance objectives as the core, and these various approaches that are currently Framework A and Framework B were guidance, meaning that an applicant could choose to use that pathway, or they could choose to use something else that works better for them. They're optional instead of codified in the regulation. Then that lets the framework keep the objectives in the rule where they need to be, but make the way to get to those objectives flexible.
Correct. And I guess that's what I'm trying to hope for of a Part 53, which is basically explaining what these basic objectives are. And a lot of the times you have to cross-reference them with different new regs. So it is a really cumbersome process to make sure that when you apply, whether it's a Part 50 or Part 52, you're like, for example, Xenon and Krypton, right? Releases, like it's regulated by the EPA, not the NRC, but you still have to reference that in your NRC application to be able to show that, or at least demonstrably show that you are basically protecting, or at least from a radio protection perspective, caring for the local dose accepted for workers. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, and maybe this is what you were disagreeing on, but do you think that, because I think that Part 53 in and of itself, where it's not telling you need to use these specific mechanisms that are very prescriptive for guaranteeing safety, right? Specific type of pumps or a specific apparatus that is
Right.
fully linked to light water reactors. But what I've also seen and experienced firsthand is the Canadian licensing process, which isn't prescriptive per se on that basis, but can definitely send you into a whirlpool of forever licensing. Because it's a lot of times the Canadian regulations or like the vendor design review, for example, you would go to the regulator and they'd say the vendor design review is like a pre-licensing that de-risks the overall licensing process. But you have companies that were supposed to be in that process for 3 years that are now entering their 8th year of the VDR of pre-licensing. So it just goes to show that this is not something that's only, you know, a problem in the US. But I guess to really come back to my original question, so you think that lumping the technology agnostic objectives and the capacity, you know, having different capacities, therefore requiring different regulations, basically packaging that into one Part 53 is still the best way to go.
I don't think you need different capacities or different regulations for different sizes. If you have a gigawatt scale reactor and it can meet the same dose in the event of a maximum accident as a 1 megawatt microreactor, then it's meeting its safety objective. Whatever barriers and defense in depth you need to achieve that, as long as you're achieving that adequate protection of the public, that's the objective. The ways to get there can be defined as what is acceptable for different size classes in guidance, such as current guidance, new Reg Guide 1.233 is guidance on the licensing modernization project that NEI and others asked the NRC to approve as a new pathway of how to approach Part 50. Using a very PRA heavy approach. Part 50 doesn't require PRA at all. They said, if we want to do a PRA, can we modernize it doing this? That's didn't change the regulation of Part 50 at all. But it's a pathway that the NRC then could say, we approve that this satisfies Part 50, right? All of those class level things or framework A and B can just be in guidance like that from the start, with the high level objectives itself being in the rule.
So it could be licensed with Part 50 or Part 52. That's basically even as an advanced reactor that's non-light water reactor.
Yeah, there are pathways for that.
Yeah. I must have misheard. Because basically my understanding was at one point you were saying that we kind of have to advertise for that Part 50, Part 52, because otherwise, you know, there'd be no funding, you know, flowing into this sector. But there's a real path. You know?
There is a path. You still need all the exemptions and stuff.
Correct.
But there are other rulemakings going on to try to classify certain exemptions that would be automatically granted to non-light water reactors, for instance.
Right.
That's going really slow. But like, as I said in my presentation, there are some efforts to make 50 and 52 better for advanced reactors. They're just not there yet.
And just to talk, like, cap the difference in is that I know that there's also a lot of things related to operator requirements, preliminary, you know, emergency or evacuation plans, etc. And a lot of the contention as well that I see within the microreactor and small modular reactor community is saying that these existing guidelines are basically created for gigawatt scale reactors, which is why they think that a lot of the regulations are being proposed are onerous or extremely onerous in terms of, you know, having you know, firefighters on site or you know, all types of emergency response on site that you would not necessarily require for a microreactor or should not be as significant for a microreactor. So when I was talking about creating a different licensing regime for different outputs, it was more so addressing that bit, which is like, you know, the heavy infrastructure associated with a nuclear facility or installation as we know it. Because and by the way, I'm so sorry, this is a long question, but because obviously I know this space just a bit too. But I've spent a lot of time cross-referencing all the different Part 50, Part 52, all the new regs that came out with production facilities, utilization facilities, non-power reactors, research reactor, test reactors, and they all fall under different little legislations that require different things. And so it's definitely super interesting to see how, whether it's a research or a test reactor, the requirements on site of security vary enormously. So that's why I was talking about having maybe commercial reactors with a different, regulation. But anyways, I digress.
Thanks, Carl. Just want to make sure, Dr. Stein, you're okay with a couple of more questions?
I could probably do one more. It's kind of
All
late.
right.
I have to.
All right, Mr. Keith, close it up.
Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Stein. This has been extremely educational, and I think we've all gotten a lot out of this. But I guess I just wanted to have a big picture question. We're all, as advocates for nuclear, we're trying to figure out, where to spend our time, and the idea of a nuclear renaissance is something we'd all like to see happen, but but there are various stumbling blocks, whether that's public perception, whether that's the economics or the supply chains, the HALO availability, all that stuff. I guess I was wondering if you could comment on, where this issue of NRC bureaucracy or dysfunctionality, where does that fit into the set of problems? How would you rank this in terms of the severity, in terms of impacting putting in jeopardy the renaissance that we'd like to see happen?
This is the most severe, which is why that's where I spend most of my time, because it is quite literally a barrier. If it could be a barrier. There's multiple pathways to potentially get HALO in the future. People are working on that. There's building a workforce is always a challenge in any sector, and it happens a little bit here, a little bit there, right? It's organic. But everybody has to go through the NRC. And in my view, there wasn't enough very fact-based, analysis-based work going on in the public interest at the NRC to get things on track. And so that's why we put most of our effort there. Clearly, if we can't finance them, nobody's going to actually build them. But there's been huge efforts to change that recently. The Inflation Reduction Act, the IIJA provided funding or tax incentives to do so. They also provided significant loan guarantee opportunities, which is essentially an opportunity to buy down an interest rate on financing, which is the single largest cost of building a new nuclear plant is the interest. And so buying that down helps economic viability significantly. Where we haven't made a significant stride is at the NRC.
Are there other countries that are doing it right? Canada or some other places that we could be looking to as examples?
Canada is doing it differently. I wouldn't say it's right, but it definitely is more on track than here right now. It's encouraging that they are sharing information back and forth. They have MOUs to look at multiple designs in tandem and share information to help streamline things. But one thing that Canada does much better, in my view, than the NRC is pre-application. The NRC says you should talk to us early in pre-application, go over things, but it's all applicant-led. The applicant decides what they think they need to talk to the NRC about, even though they probably have never licensed a reactor before, because none of them have, except GE and Westinghouse. And so they don't have the experience of what questions to even ask, right? So they're going in these meetings, just talking about a topic. The NRC staff sits there and listens, and then the meeting's over and nobody's accomplished anything. In Canada, you submit for a standard design review. You send in, they tell you what they would need to review it, and then they send back to you as a product for what you're paying for, an actual review of your safety case, what you might be missing, what you're going to have to address potentially, or even change your design if something's severe enough before you would submit a full application. The NRC just says, come talk to us, let's chat. And then they don't chat, they just listen.
I guess one last thing I wanted to ask, in terms of things that come up, the responsiveness of NRC to deal with issues that come up. I mean, one of the things that has gotten attention lately is, I guess at Vogel, there was a pipe that was shaking and needed some brace on it or something that cost like $1 million a day to deal with that. Is that emblematic of some of the problem we have here, or?
No, that is an NRC success story.
Okay.
So
you-
really short. Southern said, we're assuming it's going to take a license amendment and 30 days to get that license amendment. So it's about $1 million a day. So it's going to cost us $30 million. They have to make that public because of all their agreements with monitoring costs with their various funders and things. And they estimate on the high end in case it went that long. What really happened after that statement came out is they got a public meeting within 24 hours of asking for one, which usually takes 1 to 2 weeks to set up. They sent their application for this license amendment to the NRC, had this public meeting, got feedback at the public meeting and in writing, revised their application 2 days later, submitted it to the NRC, and within about 24 hours got their actual license amendment. The NRC could not have gone faster on that.
Okay.
The issue was if they weren't already in the startup process, which is operations, if they still were in the construction phase, this would have been trivial. They would have literally just gone in like this was a gas plant and fixed the thing. And then told the NRC that we fixed the thing. It wasn't the wrong pipe brace. It wasn't they realized they had to add a new one. They literally didn't install it correctly and nobody caught it. So what they had to go in and do was build the plant correctly. That's what they had to do. But because it was in mode 4 and that safety system had to be operational per their application tech spec in mode 4, they normally would have had to shut down to cold before they fixed it. So their amendment was to modify that tech spec before first criticality only, so they could stay in mode 4 and not waste 30 days cooling the plant down and then heating it back up to where it was, and then go in and fix it where it was. So all in all, Southern made it as big as they could in case it was a problem, but it ended up being a success story.
So is it kind of like the publicity may have helped everybody to put their heads together and so that it would not become an embarrassment?
It's possible. There definitely was a lot of pressure on the NRC after saying that.
Great. We'll leave it there. So thank you so much, Dr. Stein. It's really helpful for all of us who want to build nuclear now. So what would you think, like if we are advocates, what we should just go to Build Nuclear Now and sign up? What else do you think we should be doing?
I would say sign up there. Soon we're going to start putting out action alerts through Build Nuclear Now to everybody that signs up, asking you to contact either the NRC or your Congress member or whatever is relevant for that particular action to try to put pressure on where we think pressure is most needed.
Great. Well, thank you again, and for you and all the work that you and your team do. And thank you everybody for sticking around and asking really good questions and being engaged in this work.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Trillion yen or $55 billion.
Thanks.
And Japan's prime minister, whom you
And thank you, Nuclear New York, for hosting.
been